"I'm not your toy," my wife snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the thick silence of our living room. I remember looking at her, the tension in her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and instead of apologizing or backing down, I gave her a smile that I knew would only make her angrier. "You're right," I said evenly, almost casually. "Toys are fun." That was the moment everything shifted, the moment I knew the life we had built was about to collapse in on itself. What started as a passionate love story, full of laughter and promises, had slowly turned into something neither of us recognized. A battlefield where words were weapons and trust had become a memory. And while my response may have sounded cruel, it was also my own cry of rebellion, a refusal to keep being cornered into submission. This is the story of how love transformed into resentment, how two people who once swore to protect each other became the very ones who tore each other apart, and how walking away became the only path to freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I first met Dana, the world around us felt like it cracked open to let us step into a reality reserved only for the fortunate. She was radiant in ways that words fail to capture. Her laughter was the kind that made heads turn, and her confidence gave her an aura that made everything else fade into the background. I was a different man back then. Quieter, perhaps too eager to please, but Dana's energy drew me in. She carried herself like she owned the air in every room, and I, in my admiration, was content to orbit her world. Our beginning wasn't just romantic, it was intoxicating, the kind of connection that makes you believe in fate. People around us used to joke that we were a perfect match, that I balanced her fire with my calm, and she pushed me out of my comfort zone into a life I never thought I could live. Looking back, it's easy to see how quickly admiration can blur into submission, though at the time I called it devotion. I wanted to give her everything, to prove I was worthy of her attention. The late-night conversations, the spontaneous trips, the way she'd lean in close when she told me her dreams, it all made me feel chosen, like I was the lucky one plucked from a crowd of men who would have done anything to stand in my place. And maybe I was. But that's the thing about being chosen. You forget that you still have to choose yourself too, and somewhere along the way, I stopped doing that. The cracks in our story weren't visible in the beginning. We looked like any other couple in love, and maybe even more solid than most. We shared a tiny apartment on the east side of the city, one with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet, but it felt like paradise to us. We'd cook cheap pasta dinners, laugh until our sides hurt, and dream of the life we'd build once we got through the grind of our 20s. Dana was ambitious, always pushing for more, while I was content with what we had, and at first, those differences balanced us out. She made me want to reach higher, and I grounded her when her dreams turned too reckless. It was a dance that worked, until it didn't. I think the moment that line was spoken, "I'm not your toy," wasn't just an argument about control. It was the culmination of years of small imbalances that had built up like dust no one bothered to wipe away. My reply, "Toys are fun," wasn't meant to belittle her, though I know that's how it landed. It was a defense, a way of saying I was done playing by her rules, done being molded into the version of myself that suited her best. By then, I had spent so long bending, twisting, and reshaping myself to fit her expectations that I barely recognized the man in the mirror. What had once felt like love began to feel like performance, and in that single heated exchange, all the masks we wore slipped away. If I close my eyes now, I can still feel the weight of the silence that followed my words. It was heavier than any shouting match we ever had. Dana stared at me, shocked, furious, but also wounded in a way that made me ache despite my own anger. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I knew we had reached a point we couldn't step back from. It's strange how relationships don't usually break in grand explosions, but in subtle moments that carve deep wounds. Moments like this one, where pride speaks louder than love. That night, I lay awake long after Dana had stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door. The city outside was alive with noise, horns honking, laughter drifting from bars down the street. But inside, our apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. I replayed our fight over and over, wondering when we had lost sight of the joy that once made us unstoppable. Maybe it was when I started swallowing my opinions to keep the peace. Maybe it was when she began seeing my compromises as weakness rather than sacrifice. Or maybe it was simply inevitable. Two strong personalities who once fit together but eventually started grinding against each other like mismatched gears. And yet, as painful as that moment was, I can't deny it was also freeing. For the first time in years, I spoke without censoring myself, without trying to soften my edges for her comfort. My words may have cut deep, but they were honest, and honesty, however brutal, was something we had been lacking for a long time. What happened next? How our story unraveled, the highs and lows that followed. That's where the real lessons lie. But it all began here, with one sentence, one reply, one moment where everything changed. Before the arguments, before the sharp words that cut deeper than either of us admitted, there was a version of my life that felt simple, even predictable. I was 31 when Dana and I first moved into our modest apartment, and though I didn't have much by way of material wealth, I carried a steady rhythm in my days. I worked as an assistant manager at a logistics company, a job that wasn't glamorous by any means but gave me a sense of stability I had always craved. My parents raised me in a household where predictability was prized over risk, where showing up on time and doing the right thing mattered more than standing out or making noise. So naturally, when I stepped into adulthood, I clung to the same values. I was not a man of surprises. I was a man of schedules, routines, and careful planning. That was me before Dana entered my orbit like a storm no one could have predicted. Our world together, at least at the beginning, was structured around contrasts. I was steady, reserved, the kind of man who preferred a quiet night with a book to a crowded bar. Dana, on the other hand, thrived in chaos. She loved social gatherings, late-night debates, chasing opportunities that seemed just beyond reach. Where I was cautious, she was daring. Where I saw risk, she saw adventure. And for a time, I thought that balance made us perfect. She would pull me into new experiences, and I, in return, would anchor her when she drifted too far from the shore. My friends used to tease me that I was living out a character, attending concerts, going on spontaneous road trips, even picking up hobbies I never thought I'd try, like salsa dancing or kayaking. Dana made me feel alive in a way I didn't know I was missing, and I believed with all my heart that was what love was supposed to do. If someone had asked me then what I valued most, I would have said loyalty. That was my compass, the thing that guided my decisions and relationships. I wasn't the loudest man in the room, but I was steady, dependable, the kind of person you could call at 3 in the morning and know I'd pick up. I brought that same devotion into my marriage, believing that if I poured myself fully into Dana, if I gave her my time, my patience, my unwavering support, then she would feel secure and loved enough to always choose me. It wasn't about control. It was about faith in the idea that love was an equation you could solve with enough effort and sacrifice. But what I didn't understand back then was that devotion can blur into self-erasure, and loyalty, if not reciprocated, begins to feel less like love and more like chains. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our daily life reflected this dynamic long before either of us realized it. I'd wake up early to brew coffee and pack lunches while Dana slept in, often exhausted from staying up late working on her creative projects or catching up with friends. I didn't mind. I told myself it was my way of contributing, of showing love. After work, I'd hurry home, often skipping drinks with colleagues because I wanted to be by her side. She, meanwhile, would be in the middle of something, painting, writing, planning her next career move. And though she'd kiss me hello, her attention was rarely mine for long. Still, I convinced myself that being present, being available, was enough. I had built an identity around being the reliable partner, the one who never faltered, and I wore that badge with pride even as I started to feel invisible in my own home. The truth is, my world was small before Dana, and maybe that's why I clung so tightly to her once she became part of it. My circle of friends had dwindled over the years, many of them moving to different cities or getting caught up in families of their own. My family, though supportive, lived several states away and kept their involvement in my life to polite phone calls and occasional visits. Without Dana, my days would have been reduced to work, a few TV shows, and maybe the occasional night at the gym. She filled the quiet spaces with her energy, and I mistook that for completeness. I thought she was the missing piece, rather than an addition to a life I was supposed to build for myself too. That mindset, believing she was the center rather than a partner, set the stage for everything that followed. Looking back now, I can see that my normal wasn't as healthy as I believed it to be. My routines, while comforting, left little room for growth. I was a man who avoided conflict, who would rather swallow discomfort than voice it, and Dana, sharp and outspoken, sensed that in me. At first, she admired my patience, often telling me I was the calm in her storm. But over time, I think she began to view it as passivity, as weakness. And maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. I had built my identity around being the steady one, but in doing so I neglected to define boundaries, to assert myself in ways that would have protected both of us from the cracks that widened between us later. The version of me that existed before our troubles, the man of routines, of loyalty, of quiet devotion, wasn't a bad man. He was simply unprepared for what love demands when it's tested by reality. It's easy to believe in forever when everything feels fresh and exciting. It's much harder to hold on to yourself when the person you love begins to test the very limits of who you are. That was the foundation I stood on, fragile though I didn't know it yet. And it was on that foundation that Dana and I began to build a life that, while beautiful on the surface, carried within it the seeds of our unraveling. It began in the most unexpected of places, a friend's engagement party at a small rooftop bar downtown. I hadn't planned on going that evening, truthfully. I'd just wrapped up a grueling week at work, and the thought of mingling with acquaintances I barely knew seemed exhausting. But a close friend convinced me, insisting it would be good for me to get out of my routine for once. I remember stepping into that lively atmosphere, the fairy lights strung overhead, the faint hum of music blending with the chatter of guests, and then noticing her, Dana, across the room. She wasn't dressed extravagantly, not compared to some of the others, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made her impossible to overlook. Her laughter rose above the crowd, warm and magnetic, and I felt pulled toward it like a moth to flame. We were introduced through a mutual friend, and what was supposed to be a polite exchange of names quickly turned into a 2-hour conversation that eclipsed the party itself. She was quick-witted, challenging, and refreshingly unfiltered. While most people tread carefully when they first meet someone new, Dana asked questions that dug deeper, about my ambitions, my fears, even my regrets. I was caught off guard by her directness, but instead of recoiling, I found myself opening up in ways I rarely did. She had that effect, drawing out the parts of you usually kept tucked away. At one point, she teased me for being too careful, saying I seemed like the kind of man who lived life with a safety net permanently strapped on. It stung a little, but when she smiled afterward, it felt more like a challenge than an insult. By the time the night ended, I was smitten, though I wouldn't have admitted it outright. Our first dates carried that same intoxicating energy. We went for late-night drives with no destination, stopping at diners just before dawn to drink bad coffee and share stories like we had known each other for years. She was spontaneous in ways that thrilled me. I still remember the night she dragged me onto a karaoke stage despite my protests, insisting that life is too short to care about who's watching. My voice cracked horribly through the song, but she clapped like I had just given the performance of a lifetime. In return, I offered her steadiness, small acts of thoughtfulness she wasn't used to. She once told me, almost shyly, that she had never dated anyone who remembered the little details, her favorite tea, the fact that she hated lilies but loved tulips, or that she couldn't sleep without a fan running. I wore that as a badge of honor, convinced I was showing her a kind of love that could outlast anything. Those early days were golden. We spent weekends exploring the city, wandering through bookstores, sampling street food, and discovering hidden corners we made our own. Every memory from that time feels bathed in warm light, untouched by the shadows that would later creep in. My friends, who had always described me as reserved, noticed the change immediately. "You're different around her," one of them said during a casual hangout. And I was. Dana made me bolder, more alive, like she'd lit a spark in a part of me I didn't even know was waiting for fire. I thought that was proof she was the one. But if I'm honest with myself, there were signs even then, small moments that I brushed aside because I was too enchanted to see them clearly. Dana had a way of dominating conversations, often dismissing opinions she didn't agree with in a way that left others silenced. Once, during a dinner with friends, she interrupted me mid-story and corrected me about a trivial detail. It wasn't cruel, just assertive, but the look in her eyes made it clear she wanted control of the narrative. I laughed it off. not wanting to dampen the evening, but I remember feeling a flicker of discomfort. Another time, when we disagreed about where to spend the weekend, she grew visibly annoyed until I gave in, convincing myself it wasn't worth arguing over. At the time, I saw these things as quirks, the kind of harmless traits every person brings into a relationship. What I didn't realize was how easily quirks can evolve into patterns. Despite these moments, I couldn't deny how deeply I was falling. I introduced her to my family after only 3 months, something I had never done with anyone else. My mother noticed Dana's confidence immediately, commenting privately later that she seemed like someone who knows what she wants. I took it as a compliment, though there was a hint of caution in my mother's tone I chose to ignore. My father, ever the observer, simply said, "She's got a strong spirit. You'll need to match it, son." I laughed at the time, brushing off his words, believing love alone would bridge any gap. What drew me in the most was the way Dana dreamed. She spoke about the future with conviction, painting pictures of a life filled with art, travel, and possibility. Her words carried me out of my small world of routines and into a horizon that felt limitless. I found myself wanting to give her everything she imagined, to be the man who made those dreams possible. And maybe that's where I started to lose myself, when I stopped asking what I wanted and began measuring my worth by how much of her vision I could make real. It was a love story written in bold strokes, filled with passion and promise, and I believed it was unshakable. Those early days felt like proof that we were meant for each other, destined to withstand whatever challenges life would throw our way. I didn't yet know that those very challenges would come from within, that the qualities I admired in her strength, her determination, her intensity, would one day clash with the very core of who I was. But at the start, none of that mattered. All I knew was that I had found someone who made my world brighter, and I was willing to give everything I had to keep that light burning. The first few years with Dana felt like living inside a story I never wanted to end. Every morning I woke up beside her, and it seemed impossible that a man like me had stumbled into a love so full of fire and promise. We were young enough to still believe in grand gestures and big dreams, yet old enough to know how rare it was to find someone who made even the most ordinary days feel like an adventure. Those were the golden days, when we laughed more than we argued, when the rhythm of our lives played like music we both knew the words to. I still remember the way she would sprawl across our small couch with a blanket wrapped around her, sketching ideas in her notebook while I cooked dinner, filling the apartment with the smell of garlic and tomato sauce. We didn't need fancy restaurants or exotic vacations, though we took some when we could. We were content to build a world out of simple joys. There was a summer in particular, 2 years into our marriage, that I often revisit in my mind. Dana had just finished a series of paintings she was especially proud of, and she rented a tiny booth at a weekend art fair downtown. I spent those days standing beside her, watching her come alive as she explained her work to strangers, her hands moving animatedly, her eyes sparkling with passion. I remember the pride swelling in me when someone purchased her largest canvas, a piece she had poured weeks into. We celebrated that night with cheap champagne, toasting on the balcony of our apartment as the city lights flickered below. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice steady with conviction. And I believed her. I believed us. Our friends envied the ease we seemed to have with each other. We became the couple people turned to when they needed reassurance that love was still worth chasing. At dinner parties, we'd exchange knowing glances, finishing each other's sentences in ways that made others roll their eyes and laugh. I took pride in being the husband who remembered anniversaries, who surprised Dana with little notes tucked into her bag, who held her hand in public without hesitation. She, in turn, gave me a sense of belonging I had longed for all my life. For a man who had often felt invisible in rooms full of louder voices, being loved so fiercely by someone like Dana felt like validation I hadn't even realized I craved. There were nights when we stayed up until dawn, sprawled out on the floor with takeout containers scattered around us, talking about everything from childhood memories to what kind of house we wanted someday. Dana dreamed of a home filled with art, color splashed across every wall, a garden in the backyard where she could grow wildflowers. I pictured something quieter, a place with a sturdy porch and enough space for quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers. We laughed about how different our visions were, but we always ended the conversation with the same promise. Whatever the house looked like, it would be ours. Those promises built the scaffolding of our love, making it strong enough to feel indestructible. Traveling together brought out the best in us. One winter, we scraped together enough savings to spend a week in Montreal, exploring cobblestone streets dusted with snow. Dana dragged me into shops where I couldn't afford a single thing, laughing at my discomfort until I loosened up enough to try on scarves I didn't need just to make her smile. Another year, we drove across 3 states just to see her favorite band play live, singing at the top of our lungs as the highway stretched endlessly before us. These trips weren't glamorous, but they were ours, stitched into the fabric of our story as reminders of why we kept choosing each other every day. It wasn't just the big moments, though. It was the small ones that made me certain I had found something rare. The way she'd fall asleep with her head on my chest, her breath steady and warm. The way she'd insist on dancing in the kitchen while we waited for pasta to boil, pulling me into her rhythm until I stopped resisting and let myself be silly. She had this uncanny ability to make even the mundane feel magical, to take a Tuesday night and turn it into a memory worth holding on to. And I, in my quiet way, matched her by creating a foundation of security she could always return to. Together, we built a life that felt balanced, even if I didn't realize then how precarious that balance truly was. People used to ask me what the secret was, and I'd always say the same thing: we make each other better, and in those days it was true. She pushed me to be more daring, more adventurous, to step outside the boundaries I had drawn so tightly around myself. I helped her slow down, find rest in moments when her ambition threatened to burn her out. It was give and take, fire and calm, and I thought that as long as we kept seeing each other as complements, nothing could shake us. I clung to that belief, treasuring the evidence of our love in photo albums, anniversary dinners, and the way my heart still raced when she smiled at me across a crowded room. Those were the times that made the later unraveling so much harder to accept. Because when you've lived through nights of laughter so deep your stomach aches, when you've stood arm in arm watching fireworks light up the sky while whispering promises of forever, it feels impossible to imagine that love could turn into something sharp and heavy. But it did. And maybe that's why I held on for so long when the cracks began to show. Because I remembered these good times, these golden years, and I couldn't bring myself to believe they had slipped so far out of reach. The first cracks were almost invisible, small enough that I told myself they were normal, the kind of disagreements every couple faces. At first, they showed up in subtle ways, moments so fleeting they could easily be excused as stress, tiredness, or simple personality differences. But those moments stacked quietly, like pebbles dropped into a jar, until one day the jar wasn't empty anymore. I remember the first time I felt it, a pang of unease that I couldn't quite name, when Dana dismissed something I cared about as though it were trivial. I had spent months saving for a camera, wanting to try my hand at photography, something I had admired from a distance for years. When I finally bought it, excited to show her my new hobby, she gave it a quick glance and said, "That's nice, but you'll probably get bored of it in a few weeks." She laughed when she said it, as if it were just a playful jab, but the words stuck like a thorn. I told myself not to overthink it, but deep down I felt unseen, as if my joy didn't matter. Then came the decisions, little choices that should have been ours but increasingly became hers. Where we spent our weekends, how we decorated our apartment, even what we cooked for dinner, often defaulted to her preferences. She was persuasive, and it was easier to give in than to push back. When I did try to voice an opinion, she had a way of talking over me, brushing aside my words with that sharp confidence I once admired. I would retreat into silence, convincing myself it was a small price to pay for harmony. But over time, silence stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like erasure. There was a dinner with friends where I began telling a story about a trip we took, and Dana interrupted to correct me on the details. She did it with a smile, not malice, but the way everyone's attention shifted to her left me shrinking into myself. Later, in the car, I tried to bring it up and she rolled her eyes. "You're too sensitive," she said. "I was just making sure the story was accurate." I laughed it off with her, but inside something tightened, a knot I couldn't untangle. Money became another subtle battleground. I was careful with our finances, raised to believe in saving for emergencies and living within our means. Dana, on the other hand, loved to spend. New clothes, art supplies, spontaneous trips. At first, I admired her ability to live in the moment. But when I started noticing credit card bills stacking higher than we could comfortably manage, I grew anxious, Whenever I brought it up, she would tell me I was being controlling, that she wasn't a child who needed permission to spend money she earned. The conversations never ended in resolution, only in frustration, and I'd often drop the subject to avoid escalating into a fight. But each time I swallowed my concerns, I felt a little less like her partner and a little more like a bystander watching our life veer off track. There were also moments that revealed a sharper edge to her personality, moments I couldn't laugh off no matter how much I wanted to. I remember one evening when I came home exhausted from work and the apartment was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink, clothes scattered on the floor. I asked gently if we could tackle the chores together and she snapped, "You sound like my father." The comparison hit harder than she realized. I wasn't trying to scold her, only to share the load, but her tone made me feel small, as if my needs were unreasonable. Another night, after a long day, I suggested we skip a party and stay in, and she accused me of being boring, of dragging her down with my lack of energy. I laughed weakly to diffuse the tension, but I went to bed that night wondering when my company stopped being enough for her. The red flags didn't come only from her words. They seeped into the way I began to feel in her presence. There were times when I caught myself rehearsing what to say before speaking, carefully choosing words to avoid triggering her annoyance. I noticed that my shoulders tensed whenever I heard her footsteps approaching after she'd had a stressful day, bracing myself for her moods. Love should have felt like a refuge, but increasingly, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, never sure which step would throw us into imbalance. Still, I clung to the good times, telling myself these were just growing pains, that every marriage had seasons of difficulty. The people around us noticed too, though they didn't always say it outright. One afternoon, my sister visited and saw Dana snap at me over something trivial, a forgotten errand. Later, when Dana was out of the room, my sister asked quietly, "Are you okay?" I brushed it off, assuring her that Dana was just stressed, that things were fine. But her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. My closest friend once joked, half serious, that I had become Mr. Dana, as if my identity existed only in relation to hers. I laughed it away, but the sting lingered long after. Perhaps the clearest warning sign of all was how I began losing pieces of myself. The hobbies I once loved, like photography or reading late into the night, fell to the wayside because they didn't fit into her world. I stopped seeing my friends as often, always choosing her plans over theirs, until invitations eventually stopped coming. My days revolved around keeping her happy, smoothing over disagreements and maintaining the illusion of harmony. And though I told myself it was worth it, deep down I felt something important slipping away. Those first warning signs didn't feel catastrophic at the time. They were manageable, small storms that blew over quickly enough, leaving me hopeful the skies would clear. But looking back, I see how they were the foundation of everything that unraveled later. They were the whispers of discontent that I ignored, the early tremors of an earthquake I didn't want to believe was coming. And by the time I recognized them for what they truly were, it was already too late to pretend they didn't matter. If the warning signs had been whispers, the escalation that followed was a roar I could no longer ignore. What began as small moments of disregard soon swelled into patterns that consumed every corner of our marriage. Dana's dismissive remarks turned sharper, no longer disguised as teasing, and her impatience with me grew bolder, expressed in cutting tones and prolonged silences that felt like punishment. The tension between us wasn't confined to fleeting arguments anymore. It stretched across days, weeks, until it became the background noise of our life together. I remember a dinner where I suggested we start budgeting more seriously after realizing how deep we were slipping into debt. She didn't just disagree. She erupted, slamming her fork down so hard the sound made the table shake. "I'm not going to live like some caged animal because you're afraid of spending money," she shouted. The other diners turned to look, and I felt my face flush with humiliation. Later that night, she refused to speak to me at all, scrolling through her phone while I sat in silence, the distance between us more suffocating than the argument itself. Control became her unspoken weapon, wielded in ways that left me constantly off balance. She began monitoring how I spent my time, questioning why I stayed late at work, or why I wanted to grab a drink with a colleague. If I hesitated to answer quickly enough, she would accuse me of hiding something, her voice dripping with suspicion. Once, when I forgot to reply to a message during a busy meeting, I came back to find a string of furious texts accusing me of neglecting her. "If I'm not your priority, then who is?" she wrote, and no explanation I gave afterward could undo the damage of her assumption. The balance of trust between us began to tilt, not from anything I had done, but from the constant weight of her doubts pressing against me. Our disagreements no longer ended with apologies or reconciliation. Instead, they stretched into prolonged cycles of coldness, where Dana would retreat into silence for days, withholding even the smallest gestures of kindness. I learned to dread these quiet wars more than the shouting, because they left me feeling invisible, like I no longer existed in her world. Sometimes, in an effort to break the ice, I would apologize even when I wasn't at fault, hoping my words would melt the frost she wrapped around herself. But instead of easing the tension, my apologies seemed to empower her, as though my willingness to surrender proved I was the weaker one. Each time, a little more of my self-respect eroded, replaced by the desperate desire to keep the peace at any cost. What hurt most wasn't just her sharp words or cold silences, but the way she began to rewrite the story of who I was. She would mock my ideas in front of others, calling me too cautious or boring, disguising cruelty as humor. At gatherings with friends, she took control of conversations, leaving me a silent observer at my own table. I recall one evening where she told a story about me fumbling while fixing a leaky sink, exaggerating every detail for laughs. Everyone chuckled, and I forced a smile, but inside I felt like a caricature of myself, reduced to the butt of her jokes. Later, when I asked her not to belittle me in front of others, she rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. People were laughing with you, not at you." But I knew the difference, and each time she did it, I felt myself shrinking further from the man I once recognized in the mirror. The fights began to bleed into every area of our lives. Even mundane decisions became battlegrounds. Grocery shopping turned into arguments about what brands to buy. Choosing a movie ended with her accusing me of never considering her preferences, even though I had stopped choosing at all. Our intimacy suffered too, becoming less about connection and more about control. Some nights she demanded closeness on her terms, dismissing my exhaustion, while other nights she withdrew completely, using rejection as another form of silent punishment. The bedroom, once a space of comfort, became just another place where I felt powerless, unsure of what would set her off next. Friends and family began noticing my absence more than my presence. Invitations dwindled, not because they stopped caring, but because I rarely accepted anymore. Dana often criticized the people I cared about, saying they were a bad influence or didn't understand our relationship. Over time, I found it easier to cut ties than to defend them, until my world outside of her had grown painfully small. My sister once asked why I no longer came to family dinners, and I lied, saying work kept me busy. The truth was that Dana made it clear she didn't enjoy being around my relatives, and choosing them meant enduring her wrath later. Slowly, the isolation became complete, and I found myself trapped in a world that revolved only around her moods, her demands, her approval. The financial strain worsened as well. Despite my attempts to manage our expenses, Dana's spending spiraled out of control. She justified every purchase as necessary for her happiness. Designer clothes, spa treatments, impulsive trips with her friends. When I tried to protest, she accused me of trying to control her freedom. "You want to chain me down," she snapped one night after I pointed out another maxed-out credit card. "I won't let you." The irony was bitter. I was the one shackled by her choices, yet she painted herself as the prisoner. I started working overtime, not because I wanted to, but because I had to keep up with the debts piling around us. The extra hours drained me, but even that became another weapon she used. "You're never around anymore," she accused, as though my absence was a choice rather than a necessity she created. The emotional toll was relentless. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering when our love had twisted into this endless cycle of conflict and control. I thought of the vows we had exchanged, the promises of partnership and support, and I wondered if they had ever meant the same thing to her as they did to me. I began questioning my own worth, convinced that perhaps I wasn't enough, that maybe I was the problem all along. But deep down, a small voice whispered that this wasn't what love was supposed to feel like. Love wasn't supposed to drain you until nothing was left but exhaustion and fear of the next fight. By the time I realized how deep we had fallen into dysfunction, it felt impossible to climb out. The problems weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were the fabric of our daily life, woven so tightly into everything we did that I couldn't see where the pattern ended and I began. Every attempt I made to fix things only seemed to strengthen the very chains I wanted to break. I was no longer just enduring a troubled marriage. I was surviving it, day by day, hoping each morning would bring a peace that never came. It wasn't until the weight of Dana's control began spilling beyond our private walls that I truly started to see how far things had gone. Because when you're living inside chaos long enough, you convince yourself it's normal. But then other people started noticing. I remember a night when my oldest friend Marcus invited me out for a quiet drink. I hadn't seen him in months because Dana always seemed to find a reason to dissuade me, saying my friends were childish, immature, or secretly jealous of me. But that evening, after weeks of suffocating silence between Dana and me, I needed an escape. Marcus sat across from me at the dimly lit bar, his brow furrowed as he studied me like I was a stranger. "Man, you look drained," he said, his voice heavy with concern. I tried to brush it off with a laugh, claiming work had been brutal lately, but he didn't buy it. "It's not just work, is it? Something's eating at you." I hesitated, the instinct to protect Dana's image colliding with the truth clawing to be spoken. For the first time, I let a few details slip: the constant arguments, the endless criticism, the way she monitored my every move. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward and said, "That's not marriage. That's a prison." The words hit me like a blow to the chest because deep down I knew he was right, yet hearing it aloud made it undeniable. It wasn't just Marcus. Even at work, colleagues began to sense something was wrong. I used to be energetic in meetings, quick with ideas and eager to take on new projects. Now I was distracted, weary. My confidence slowly eroded by Dana's constant belittling. My boss, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Patel, pulled me aside after a presentation where I had stumbled through points I once could have delivered effortlessly. "You've always been one of my sharpest people," she said gently. "But lately it seems like something's weighing you down. Is everything okay at home?" I gave her the same deflections I offered everyone else. But the concern in her eyes lingered. It was as if the mask I wore so tightly had begun to crack, and no matter how hard I tried, the truth seeped through the fractures. Even my sister Clara, who had always been patient, reached her breaking point one Sunday afternoon. She came by unannounced, carrying a basket of food like she used to when we were younger. Dana, displeased by the intrusion, retreated upstairs after a frosty hello, leaving Clara and me at the kitchen table. As we talked, Clara's eyes darted around the house, landing on the unpaid bills stacked on the counter, the tension etched in my face, the hollowness in my voice. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You've always been the one holding everyone else together, but now it feels like you're disappearing piece by piece. You can't keep living like this." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was overreacting, but the tears stinging my eyes betrayed me. She reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "This isn't love. It's control. And you deserve better." Her words replayed in my mind for days, echoing louder than Dana's scolding or silence. Still, even with these outside voices validating what I already knew deep down, I felt paralyzed. There was always the hope, however faint, that things might turn around, that Dana would remember the promises we made and soften again. But hope became harder to cling to as the days darkened further. Dana's behavior escalated, becoming less about petty control and more about domination. One evening, when I forgot to pick up the exact brand of wine she wanted, she unleashed a fury I hadn't seen before. She hurled the bottle across the kitchen, glass shattering across the floor as her face twisted with rage. "You can't do a single thing right," she screamed, her voice hoarse with venom. I stood frozen, staring at the shards scattered like pieces of my sanity, and something inside me broke. That night, as I swept the glass into a dustpan, my hands trembling, I realized how far gone we were. This wasn't just about disagreements or mismatched expectations anymore. This was about survival. I began noticing how my body reacted when I heard her footsteps on the stairs, the way my chest tightened, my pulse quickened, as though bracing for impact. I wasn't living in a marriage. I was living in a state of constant alarm. And yet, as suffocating as it was, I still couldn't fully admit to myself that I had to leave. It took one final moment, one undeniable breaking point to shatter the last threads of denial I clung to. It happened on a Saturday morning. Dana and I were supposed to visit her parents, but I had been up all night preparing reports for work, exhausted to the bone. When I told her I needed to rest for a few hours before driving, she exploded. She accused me of being lazy, of sabotaging her relationship with her family, of never caring about her needs. I tried to explain, my voice calm despite the storm she hurled at me, but she didn't want explanations. In a fit of anger, she grabbed my phone from the counter and scrolled through my messages, convinced she'd find proof of betrayal. "Who's this colleague you're always talking to? Why are you working late with her?" she demanded, waving the phone like a weapon. I snatched it back, finally raising my voice, telling her she had no right to invade my privacy. That's when she looked me in the eye, her voice ice cold, and said, "If you don't like it, you can leave. But you won't, because you're too weak." The words sliced through me, not because of their cruelty, but because they carried a chilling truth. She believed I was trapped, that I was too broken to walk away, and until that moment, she had been right. I stood there, trembling with a mix of fury and despair, realizing that the woman I once loved no longer saw me as a partner but as a possession, a toy she could bend and break at will. That was my rock bottom, the moment when denial turned to clarity. All the validation from Marcus, Miss Patel, and Clara coalesced into a single piercing thought. This is not love, and if I don't leave now, I never will. The morning after Dana's icy declaration that I was too weak to leave her, I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight cutting through the blinds like sharp blades. My body felt heavy, but my mind was strangely clear, as if something inside me had finally clicked into place. For years I had been shackled by guilt, fear, and the desperate hope that things might improve. But those words, her certainty that I was powerless, ignited something I didn't know I still possessed. I realized that if I didn't act now, she would be right forever, and I refused to let my life be reduced to a caricature of weakness. That day, instead of following my usual routine of appeasement and silence, I made a choice. It wasn't dramatic, and it didn't come with shouting or grand announcements. It began with a quiet, steady decision that I would no longer bend myself into pieces just to survive her storms. I would begin to plan my way out. The first step was secrecy. Dana thrived on control, and if she suspected I was preparing to leave, she would tighten her grip until escape became impossible. So I started small. I opened a separate bank account under my name, funneling bits of money from overtime pay into it. It wasn't much at first, but it was something tangible, a sign that I was building a foundation outside of her reach. I also began to gather documents, my birth certificate, my passport, financial records, hiding them in a folder at work so she couldn't find them at home. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, like bricks quietly laid into the structure of a new life. I also started reaching out to the few connections I had left, the ones Dana hadn't completely severed. I called Marcus one evening under the guise of catching up, but when he heard the strain in my voice, he cut through the pleasantries. "You're leaving her, aren't you?" he asked. I hesitated, then whispered yes, as if saying it aloud might summon her from the shadows. He didn't laugh, didn't doubt me. Instead, he said, "Good. You don't need her permission to save yourself. Just tell me what you need." That simple reassurance was like a lifeline. I wasn't alone anymore, even if the road ahead still felt perilous. Of course, Dana didn't make it easy. Her suspicions grew sharper as I began asserting myself in small ways, declining to argue over trivial things, refusing to rise to her bait when she mocked me in front of others, drawing firmer boundaries when she demanded explanations for every text message I sent. The more I resisted, the more she tried to reassert control. One evening, when I told her I had plans to grab dinner with Marcus, she accused me of abandoning her. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back," she threatened, her eyes blazing. For the first time, I didn't back down. I looked at her, steady and calm, and said, "If that's how you feel, maybe I shouldn't." Then I left. My heart raced the entire evening, terrified of what I might find when I returned. But when I walked back through the door and saw her icy silence, I realized something profound. She no longer terrified me. Her threats only had power when I believed them. The emotional shift inside me was startling. I began to see Dana not as an all-powerful force, but as a deeply insecure woman whose need for control had consumed everything in her path. That didn't excuse her cruelty, but it stripped away the illusion that she held all the cards. Each day I stayed in that house after my decision felt less like imprisonment and more like the final countdown before my escape. I started planning the logistics with precision. Clara, my sister, offered me her guest room if I needed a place to land. Marcus connected me with a lawyer who specialized in difficult separations. I learned about my rights, about how to protect my finances and shield myself from Dana's manipulations. Knowledge became armor, and with each step my resolve hardened. The hardest part was not second-guessing myself. There were nights when Dana showed glimpses of the woman I had once loved. Moments of charm, fleeting laughter, even tenderness. She would curl beside me and talk about the future as if the years of torment had never happened. For a moment, I would feel the pull of nostalgia, the aching desire to believe she could change. But then I would remember the shattered glass on the kitchen floor, the venom in her voice when she called me weak, and the countless times she had chipped away at my soul. Love, I realized, wasn't supposed to hurt like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like drowning, and I could no longer sacrifice my future to a ghost of the past. One night, as I packed a small duffel bag with essentials, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I saw not a beaten-down man, but someone standing at the threshold of freedom. My hands still trembled, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, knowing Dana wouldn't take it well. Still, I was determined to keep it calm, controlled, and final. This wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. This was about reclaiming my life. When the day came, I waited until a Saturday morning when Dana was sipping coffee at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady as I said, "Dana, I'm leaving." She looked up, startled, then laughed as if I had told a joke. "You? Leave me? Don't be ridiculous." But when I didn't smile, when I stood tall and repeated the words with clarity, the laughter faded. Her face darkened, her eyes narrowing as she spat venom about how I would never survive without her. I let her speak, let her rage, but I didn't flinch. When she was done, I picked up my bag and walked out the door. The air outside hit me like a baptism, sharp and clean, and for the first time in years, I felt the faint flicker of freedom ignite in my chest. The day I walked out of that house with nothing but a duffel bag, and my determination marked the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. At first, freedom felt fragile, like a delicate glass I might shatter if I held it too tightly. I moved into Clara's guest room, the walls painted a calming blue that contrasted sharply with the suffocating beige tones of the home Dana had once meticulously decorated to her taste alone. The silence in my sister's house was different from the silence I had known before. It wasn't heavy or punishing. It was gentle, like a pause between breaths, and in that stillness, I began to remember what it felt like to simply exist without fear of scrutiny. The first night I slept there, I lay awake listening to the creaks of the old house and the distant hum of traffic, marveling at the strange comfort of knowing that no one would storm into the room to interrogate me or weaponize my exhaustion. It was a silence that belonged to me, and the longer I lived in it, the stronger I became. The days that followed weren't free of pain. There were moments when grief washed over me in waves, leaving me gasping at the enormity of what I had left behind. It wasn't just Dana I mourned, but the years I had invested in a marriage that had hollowed me out. I grieved the man I had been when I first said I do, filled with hope and trust, not knowing that those vows would one day become shackles. Yet alongside the grief was something new. Relief. The tension that had gripped my chest for years began to loosen. I could breathe again, even if the breaths were sometimes shaky. The weight of walking on eggshells had lifted, and I discovered that beneath the scars, there was still a self-worth salvaging. Slowly, I rebuilt my routines. I reconnected with people I had pushed away. Marcus welcomed me back into his circle without hesitation, and over beers at the same bar where he once called my marriage a prison, he grinned and said, "You finally broke free." Clara's children started knocking on my door in the mornings, inviting me to join them for pancakes, their innocent laughter reminding me that joy could exist without conditions. Even Miss Patel at work noticed the change. One afternoon, after a particularly sharp presentation, she stopped me in the hallway. "You've got your spark back," she said with a knowing smile. Those words, so simple, were proof that the darkness hadn't destroyed me completely. Of course, Dana didn't let go quietly. She flooded my phone with calls and messages swinging between desperate pleas and venomous insults. At first, I read them, my stomach tightening with every word. But eventually, I stopped responding. The silence I gave her was my final answer. I had spent too many years trying to explain myself, justify myself, or appease her fury. No more. The lawyer Marcus had recommended helped me through the formal separation, guiding me with patience through the legal labyrinth Dana tried to weaponize. Each signed document, each finalized detail was another step away from the chaos, another brick in the foundation of a life that belonged only to me. In the months that followed, I began rediscovering the simple pleasures that Dana had mocked or controlled out of me. I picked up books again, spending quiet evenings lost in stories that nourished rather than drained me. I returned to hiking, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots, the wind brushing against my face as I climbed trails I hadn't touched in years. With every step, I felt the world widening around me, no longer narrowed to the confines of one woman's moods. I even tried cooking again, laughing at my mistakes instead of fearing ridicule, savoring the messy, imperfect joy of feeding myself in my own way. Most importantly, I started to see myself differently. The man who once felt powerless, who believed Dana's words when she called him weak, had proven himself wrong. Weakness wasn't staying. It was never daring to leave. Strength wasn't loud or explosive. It was the quiet courage of saying enough and walking out the door. That realization became my anchor, reminding me that I hadn't just survived Dana's control, I had reclaimed my agency, my dignity, and my future. Looking back, I don't pretend the story is neatly tied up. Healing is not a straight line, and there are days when old doubts creep in, whispering questions about what I could have done differently or whether I wasted too many years. But when those thoughts come, I remind myself of the truth I earned through fire. Love should never feel like chains. Love should not diminish you, it should expand you. It should not silence you, it should amplify who you are. The scars Dana left behind will always be a part of me, but they are no longer wounds. They are reminders of the strength it took to finally break free. And if there is any wisdom in my story worth sharing, it is this. When someone convinces you that you are too weak to leave, that is the moment you must prove them wrong. Control thrives in silence and isolation, but the second you reach out, to a friend, a sibling, a colleague, you begin to reclaim your voice. The cage begins to crack. No one deserves to live as someone else's possession, reduced to an object of control. We are not toys to be played with, broken, or discarded. We are human beings with the right to dignity, freedom, and respect. So if my story finds its way to someone trapped in a similar place, I hope it becomes the spark they need to realize they are not alone, that there is life waiting on the other side of fear. Freedom is terrifying, yes, but it is also the most profound act of self-love. And when you finally step out into that fresh air, with nothing but your truth and the strength you thought you didn't have, you will discover that the world is wider, brighter, and more welcoming than you ever imagined. Because you were never weak. You were simply waiting for the moment to remember your strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.